Hi there, welcome back to Darkness Proximate. This is episode 2, and I've got my Day of the Dead shirt here on just for good measure. We finished episode 1 talking largely about the music of Bernd Alois Zimmermann and his operatic masterpiece Die Soldaten. Now, of all the various subgenres of classical music, opera probably does take the cake for being the most inclined towards extremity and darkness of expression. This trend in the 20th century probably began with the music of Richard Strauss, and in particular his two expressionist operas, Salome and Electra. Salome is based on the play by Oscar Wilde, and it's a modern updating of the biblical story of Salome, John the Baptist, and King Herod. And it's a fascinatingly intense and grotesque work. Salome seeks to corrupt John the Baptist, who's being held in prison. When he rejects her advances, she decides instead to seduce her father, performing the famous dance of the seven veils. At which point he says she can have anything she wants, and she says she wants the head of John the Baptist. And when presented with John the Baptist's severed head, she kisses it and then sings the exquisite line, "I have kissed your lips, John." And after which her father says, "Kill that woman," and she's smashed under the shields of the royal guard.
Sie sagen, dass die Liebe bitter schmecke. Allein was du dieses Weib.
Electra, which followed a couple years later and marked his first collaboration with Hugo von Hofmannsthal, is, if anything, an even darker story, this time reaching back to the ancient Greek stories of Electra and her brother avenging the murder of her father by her mother. It was my introduction to opera, interestingly enough. I turned it on one day on television, not knowing what it was. I'd never been an opera fan. I always found there was too much artifice, and I could never understand the sort of Verdian or Mozartian tendency to sing about sad songs in major keys. Well, here was an opera that was incredibly intense and in which the music did everything possible to heighten the intensity of the action. I loved it from the first hearing, and I still love it to this day. With these two operas, Strauss had set himself up as the visionary of revolutionary opera in the 20th century. And yet, with these two operas complete, he changed course, never returning again to the dark and atonal language that he'd used in these two pieces. Later on, he said that the reason that the pieces were so musically revolutionary was because of the stories that they told, and that having told those stories, he wanted to move on to different subject matter, and different subject matter for him demanded a different language. Now, this is a very controversial thing, believe it or not. The idea that a great artist might tailor their art and the language of their art to what they're trying to express flies very much in the face of mid-20th century modernist orthodoxy, which says that actually art must exist within a prescribed set of parameters, which its most extreme might mean it must not be tonal, it must not incorporate vernacular music, it must be serial, etc., etc., etc. And the idea that you would pollute your music by changing the musical language, depending on what it was you were trying to express, was largely frowned upon. I mentioned in episode 1 that to an extent, Zimmermann stood against this trend, keeping the presence of vernacular music very strong in his dark opera Die Soldaten. The biggest influence on Zimmermann as an opera composer was Alban Berg, and Berg's 2 operas, Wozzeck and Lulu, which was incomplete at the time of his death, are considered by many to be the greatest operas of the 20th century, certainly among the most influential. I mentioned in episode 1 that his one-time classmate and friend, Anton Webern, was in many ways the sort of John the Baptist of the post-war modernist movement. In other words, he sort of set the course and predicted what the future would look like with music of tremendous abstraction and discipline, with as much space and restraint in it as you can possibly imagine. Berg is closer in spirit to both Strauss, who preceded him, and Zimmermann, who followed him. And in fact, in both of these operas, the role of vernacular music is very important, not only from an expressive point of view, in other words, tapping into vernacular references to help intensify the impact of very, very dark storytelling aspects, but also from a structural and compositional point of view, that individual scenes within the operas are based on long-standing classical musical forms, things like a ricercare or a theme and variations. And so these ancient forms, which someone like Boulez would have said after the war were anachronistic and needed to be gotten rid of, not least of which would have been the symphony, in Berg's hands, they become important constructive devices in his theatrical works. Berg, in many ways, is another composer whose music represents something essential about his personality, where Strauss was telling stories with great mastery and imagination. In a way, with Berg, you feel that the stories are chosen because of who he is, not because of the project that he's interested in. Strauss could walk away from the darkness, and Berg, like Zimmermann, and like so many of the black metal artists we talked about in episode 1, could not. It's always dangerous when you bring the name Theodor Adorno into any conversation, because after all, he was more colossally wrong about more musical subjects than any writer or philosopher in history during his lifetime. But when he was right, he was the most right. And the subject he understands best of all is the music of Alban Berg. And I just want to read a little something from his preface, which gives you, I think, a sense of where the darkness in Berg's music comes from. He talks first about Haydn's Farewell Symphony, and I find the Farewell Symphony one of the greatest and most intriguing symphonies ever written. It's not at all a funny piece for me. It's a piece about death, and Adorno does seem to understand that, albeit in a somewhat condescending way, but he was condescending about almost everything. But then he says of Berg, it seems as though his entire output was directed towards surpassing Haydn's flash of inspiration, towards reshaping music itself into a metaphor of vanishing, and with music to say adieu to life. Complicity with death and urbane cordiality towards his own extinction are characteristics of his work. Only those who understand Alban Berg's music as a product of these characteristics, not as a matter of historical style, can truly experience it. So, again, we come to the question, are you the art, or do you create the art? Can you walk in and out of the darkness when and as you see fit as an artist? It's always good to have an exit plan when you go in. Or is the truly great dark art only created by artists who live, by and large, in the darkness. That trend for dark and extreme opera throughout the 20th century made its way to many other cultures, although it started as a quintessentially Germanic expression. It made it even into rock and roll. Take a piece like the rock opera The Wall by Pink Floyd, which is a profoundly dark and pessimistic commentary on celebrity and stardom, politics, demagoguery, populism, dictatorship. It's an incredibly dark work, and as a sort of Gesamtkunstwerk, as a sort of total artwork over the years, Roger Waters, who composed it, the band Pink Floyd, who performed it, and their colleagues managed to make it into a completely all-encompassing theatrical presentation, which they did live, as well as a really gripping and disturbing film, which used not only traditional filmed cinematic elements, but also very avant-garde illustrations. Not the sort of thing that you associate with so-called popular music. And yet this is one of the most successful commercial albums of all time. Another Brick in the Wall Part 2, Comfortably Numb. These are hugely popular FM radio classics that have reached the ears and hearts of hundreds of millions of listeners over the years. Another place that opera at its darkest made its way was into the music of Russia. Shostakovich in particular, his early satirical opera, The Nose, is a dark comedy, followed by Lady Macbeth of Mtsensk, the opera which famously was so violent, sexual, and offensive that it aroused the fury of none other than Joseph Stalin, who denounced it and caused a crisis in Shostakovich's life and career. One of Shostakovich's musical grandchildren, if you like, would be the composer Alfred Schnittke. And for me, maybe the darkest opera I've ever encountered, darker even than, say, Lulu or Die Soldaten, is Schnittke's Life with an Idiot. I was going through a huge Schnittke phase in the 1990s when this opera came on the scene, and I remember buying the CDs of the first recorded performance, taking it home and reading the libretto and the description, which I found so disturbing that I felt physically ill at the end of it and put off listening to the opera for many, many months. Finally, I sort of made myself, I said, I've got to confront this piece. I can't be a big wimp. And of course, the experience of listening to it, following the text word by word, was even more disturbing and upsetting. Here's a little synopsis of the plot for you. So Life with an Idiot is based on a libretto by Viktor Erofeev, who was born in 1947. The piece was written in 1991, just before the fall of the Soviet Union, and is seen by many as a critique of Soviet life and politics, and in particular, the influence that Vladimir Lenin had on Soviet life. It tells the story of a married couple who are punished for an unnamed crime, perhaps not working hard enough, perhaps simply for being intellectuals. And their punishment is a strange one. They're told to go to the local asylum and adopt an idiot with a capital I, an idiot. And so they go to the local asylum and they find one who seems harmless enough. His name is Vova. And the only thing that's particularly odd about him is that he can only say one word. That word is ek. And so they bring him back to the house, and at first he seems harmless enough, but gradually it becomes clear that he's quite deeply disturbed. He cuts his toenails with a pair of secateurs from the garden. He smears excrement on the carpet and the walls. He masturbates in person. He urinates in the fridge. Eventually, he beats the husband senseless and rapes the wife. And then things actually start to get really weird. The wife gets pregnant and falls in love with Vova. The husband becomes jealous, so Vova seduces the husband. The wife and Vova fall out. She aborts the baby. And then the wife becomes jealous of the husband's affair with the idiot and decides to win him back by uh, imitating Vova's behavior, by behaving herself as if she's insane, ripping up books and defecating on the carpet. Vova's not particularly impressed by this and decides that he can't trust her anymore. So he cuts her head off with the secateurs, the garden shears, and throws her body in the rubbish chute and runs away. And the husband is left behind, goes back to the asylum to take Vova's place, and decides to call himself Vova's son. The coda to this is that I went back to the piece 10 years later, having only listened to it the once. And the second time I heard it, I thought it was actually quite funny. Dark, disturbing, very gross, but in a way, quite funny. I mean, I could see the attempts at the humor on first encounter, but it took time for the shock and horror of the setting to get, I don't know, normalized is not the right word, but for me to absorb them and get past the shock, that I could actually see the humor and appreciate the political and cultural critique that the piece offers in a more measured and reasonable way. I should also point out that the staging of the opera would be enough to make any metalhead blush. The sheer amounts of nudity, simulated sex acts, even a giant prosthetic member that is key in the acts of rape and seduction that go on throughout, is pretty crazy stuff. And at some point, even with a bit of familiarity, you can't help but think, am I supposed to be taking this seriously or not? I was thinking about this the other night, and I was reminded of another musical act that inspires that same question for me. The heavy metal group Gwar, Gwar. If you don't know them, you really should. And they're famous for their outlandish costumes. They sort of perform as a troupe of aliens from a battle-scarred planet. They spray fake blood and other material on the audience. Their now deceased lead singer, the arch alien villain Odorous Urungus, aka David Brockie, he also had an enormous prosthetic member, which he used in concerts to spray projectile blood all over the audience. It's really gross stuff, but really not meant to be taken seriously, but also not really meant to be funny. I mean, it's not silly. It's almost silly. It's definitely not serious, but it's almost serious. It's definitely not meant to be, I don't know, parsed over like high art, but there's a lot of artistic creativity behind it. Dave Brockie died of a heroin overdose in 2014. He was a really interesting, funny, creative guy. And in a way, Gwar was a kind of Gesamtkunstwerk with this whole culture of costume design, makeup design, showmanship, all this stuff. The Gwar community was more than just, the guys in the band. It was a whole workshop of artists and artisans making the materials that they would use in their concerts. But at the end of the day, it's really hard to tell. Is this music of extreme darkness or music of outlandish humor? I don't know. It's very interesting. A little excerpt of music by Alfred Schnittke, who we talked about at some length in this episode. And this is actually my own trio's recording of his string trio. And I mentioned in episode 1 that very dark classical music can, in fact, be really well received by the general public. And this piece was always a hit with audiences. I would also say that it's a piece that has a sort of jump scare in the first movement. And of the, I don't know, 120 times that we played the piece, a good 30% of the time that we did it live, someone would actually scream at that moment in concerts. It was always fun. But what an incredible, harrowing piece. And I'm really proud of this album from Ensemble Epimeo. It was a labor of love for all of us in the group. In addition to the Schnittke, which was his last sort of masterpiece before his stroke and seems like a sort of musical foreshadowing of what was about to happen to him. There's trios by Penderecki, Weinberg, and Georges Courtag, all of which I'm very proud of. And I'm very proud of the whole look of the album. It's very uncompromising. And the cover image is by the Chinese-American photographer and artist John Yang, the father of our violist David Yang. And it's an image from a collection of photographs that he made over several years at the Jewish cemetery in Queens in New York of these little pictures, these photographs that were placed on graves there. It's dark but darkly beautiful. There's a little clip of it here to end this episode, and we'll add the whole album to the Darkness Proximate podcast. And worth pointing out, too, that, of course, the Schnittke string trio is dedicated to the memory of Alban Berg.
Musik